The roses were weeping red again. Not literally, of course, though after 20 years in the French Foreign Legion, I'd seen enough real blood to know the difference. These were just the deep crimson petals of Judge Bertrand Morel's prized hybrid tea roses dropping onto the manicured lawn like scattered evidence at a crime scene. I'd been the head groundskeeper of his Mills Lake estate for 3 years now, ever since he'd pulled some legal strings to keep me out of a French prison. Funny how life works. One day you're dodging bullets in Chad, the next you're dodging thorns in Connecticut. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. Alain, are you listening to me? Claire's voice drifted down from the marble terrace above, where she was pacing in tight circles, her phone pressed against her ear like a lifeline. Even from 30 feet away, I could hear that particular breathless quality in her tone, the same one I'd heard in barracks conversations, usually 3 seconds before someone made a career-ending mistake. Of course, darling, she continued into the phone, her French accent thickening the way it always did when she was lying. The conference in Boston runs through Sunday. I'll be staying at the Marriott downtown. I kept my head down, focusing on the rose pruning, but my ears were tuned to every word. After 2 decades of survival training, you learn to listen to everything and trust nothing. Claire had been taking a lot of these academic conferences lately. Renaissance literature symposiums, medieval poetry workshops, faculty development retreats. For someone who taught freshman composition at the local community college, she was remarkably dedicated to her professional growth, or remarkably dedicated to something else entirely. Henri? You're being ridiculous, she laughed. And there it was. That name again. Henri Laurent, the philanthropist who ran some kind of cultural foundation downtown. I'd heard her mention him before, always in passing, always with that same forced casualness that screamed deception to anyone who'd spent time interrogating prisoners of war. The late October sun was setting behind the lake, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured grounds. Judge Morel's estate sprawled across 12 acres of prime Connecticut real estate, complete with a private dock, tennis court, and enough security cameras to make a casino jealous. The judge himself was a decent man, stern but fair, the kind of old-school authority figure who still believed in honor and loyalty. He'd saved my life once, legally speaking, and I'd been repaying that debt ever since. His wife, on the other hand, was a different story entirely. I have to go, Claire said suddenly, her voice dropping to a whisper. Alain is right below me, and you know how he listens to everything. Smart woman. Paranoid, but smart. I waited until I heard her heels clicking back into the house before I straightened up, wiping the sweat from my forehead with the back of my gardening glove. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the faint smell of wood smoke from the neighbor's chimney. It should have been peaceful, the kind of evening that made you grateful to be alive and employed and far away from third world battlefields. Instead, it felt like the calm before a storm. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Judge Morel. Lucas didn't come home from school. Have you seen him? Lucas was the judge's 17-year-old son from his first marriage, a good kid, honor roll student, never caused trouble, the kind of teenager who actually called when he was going to be late. I was typing back a response when my phone rang. Unknown number, but I answered anyway. Morel residence. Listen carefully, said a voice with a thick accent. Eastern European, maybe Russian. We have the boy. If you want to see him alive, the judge will reverse his verdict in the Kozlov case. 24 hours. The line went silent. I stood there for a moment, staring at the phone, feeling that familiar cold sensation creeping up my spine, the same feeling I'd gotten in Djibouti right before the ambush, in Syria right before the bombing, in Chad right before everything went to hell. Someone had just made a very serious mistake on my property. I walked quickly toward the house, my mind already shifting into tactical mode. The Kozlov case. I remembered reading about it in the local paper. Some Russian businessman caught laundering money through his restaurant chain. Judge Morel had sentenced him to 15 years federal time just last week. Apparently, Mr. Kozlov had friends who didn't appreciate the judge's interpretation of justice. The front door opened before I could knock. Judge Morel stood there, his usually composed face pale with worry. Behind him, Claire hovered in the marble foyer, wringing her hands. "Alain, thank God," the judge said. "Lucas never came home from school. I've called his friends, his teachers." "Sir," I interrupted gently, "I think we need to sit down." We gathered in his study, a wood-paneled room lined with legal texts and family photos. I told them about the phone call, watching their faces carefully. The judge went even paler, sinking into his leather chair like a man who'd just been sentenced himself. Claire gasped and covered her mouth, but something in her eyes didn't quite match her shock. "We have to call the police," she said immediately. "No." The judge's voice was firm. "Not yet. If this is connected to the Kozlov case, involving local law enforcement could make things worse. These people, they have connections." I nodded. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to handle this personally. I have certain skills that might be useful." The judge looked at me for a long moment. He knew about my background, not all of it, but enough to understand that I wasn't just a gardener who happened to be good with roses. "What do you need?" "Access to the security footage from this afternoon, Lucas's schedule, his usual routes home, and I'll need to borrow your car, something less conspicuous than the Bentley." "Take the Honda," Claire said quickly. "It's in the garage." As we discussed logistics, I found myself watching Claire more carefully. Her concern seemed genuine enough, but there was something else there, a nervous energy that went beyond maternal worry. She kept checking her phone, glancing toward the windows, fidgeting with her wedding ring. "I should cancel my conference," she said suddenly. "I should stay here in case they call again." "No," I said, perhaps a bit too quickly. "Maintain normal routines. If they're watching the house, we don't want them to know we're taking action." She nodded, but I caught the flash of relief in her eyes. Claire Morel wanted to leave town tonight, and it had nothing to do with Renaissance literature. My phone rang again, same unknown number. "Put it on speaker," the judge whispered. "We know you're all there," the accented voice said without preamble. "The judge, the wife, the gardener. Very cozy. Here's how this works. No police, no FBI, no heroics. Just reverse the Kozlov verdict and the boy comes home safe." "The verdict is final," Judge Morel said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I can't simply—" "You can, and you will. 24 hours, or your son disappears forever." The line went silent again. In the silence that followed, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the corner, marking off precious seconds. The judge sat with his head in his hands. Claire paced to the window, staring out at the darkening lake. "There has to be another way," she murmured. I stood up, straightening my shoulders. "There is." Both of them looked at me. "I'm going to find Lucas and bring him home. Tonight." "Alain," the judge started. "These people are dangerous." "Sir, with all due respect, I've been dealing with dangerous people since before your son was born. They made a mistake taking him from here, from this property, from this family." I walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful grounds that had become my sanctuary. "They're about to learn what that mistake costs." The judge nodded slowly. "What do you need from us?" "Just stay by the phone and act normal. If they call back, stall them. Tell them you're considering their demands, but need proof of life first." I headed toward the door, then paused. "And Claire, have a safe trip to Boston." She looked startled. I'm not sure I should leave now." "Go," I said firmly. Trust me, it's better for everyone if you stick to your original plans. As I left the study, I heard them talking in low, urgent voices. The judge's deep baritone mixed with Claire's higher pitch, but I couldn't make out the words. It didn't matter. I had work to do. The Honda was a sensible sedan, dark blue and forgettable, perfect for surveillance work. I drove slowly through the winding roads around Mills Lake, my eyes scanning for anything unusual. The kidnappers had to have been watching the house, learning Lucas's routines. That meant they'd been in the area for days, maybe weeks. It also meant they'd seen Claire's comings and goings, her late nights, her weekend trips, her mysterious phone calls. Interesting coincidence, this kidnapping happening just as she was planning another out-of-town rendezvous. I parked near the high school and walked the route Lucas would have taken home, past the coffee shop where he sometimes stopped, through the small downtown area, along the tree-lined streets toward the lake. It was full dark now, streetlights casting pools of yellow illumination on the empty sidewalks. That's when I saw it. Fresh tire marks on the grass verge near Maple Street, about half a mile from the Morel estate. The kind of marks you'd get from accelerating quickly, maybe during a struggle. I knelt down, using my phone's flashlight to examine the area more carefully. Cigarette butts, foreign brand, the kind you'd find in Brighton Beach or Little Odessa. A small piece of duct tape stuck to a tree branch. And something else. A business card, partially hidden under a pile of leaves. I picked it up carefully. Laurent Cultural Foundation, it read. Henri Laurent, Executive Director. Well, well. What were the odds? I sat in the Honda for a long time, staring at Henri Laurent's business card and trying to piece together a puzzle that was getting more complicated by the minute. The card could have been dropped by anyone, of course. Laurent's foundation was involved in various community projects around Mills Lake. But finding it at what appeared to be Lucas's abduction site, just hours after I'd overheard Claire whispering his name into her phone, stretched coincidence beyond the breaking point. My phone buzzed. A text from Claire. Leaving for Boston now. Please keep me updated on Lucas. I checked the time. 9:47 p.m. Interesting time to start a 3-hour drive to an academic conference that didn't begin until tomorrow afternoon. I started the Honda and drove toward downtown, my mind shifting into the methodical analysis mode that had kept me alive in some very unpleasant places. In the Legion, we had a saying. There are no coincidences, only intelligence failures. If Claire was involved in her stepson's kidnapping, even peripherally, there would be evidence. There always was. The Laurent Cultural Foundation occupied a sleek glass building on Main Street, wedged between a boutique coffee shop and an art gallery. Even at this hour, there were lights on in the upper floors. I parked across the street and settled in to watch. At 10:23 p.m., a silver Mercedes pulled into the Foundation's private parking lot. Henri Laurent himself got out, a man in his early 50s, tall and distinguished, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. He moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. At 10:31 p.m., a familiar Honda Civic pulled in beside the Mercedes. Claire Morel got out, looking around nervously before hurrying toward the building's side entrance. She wasn't dressed for an academic conference. She was wearing a short black dress and heels, the kind of outfit you'd choose for a romantic dinner, not a Renaissance literature symposium. I waited until they were inside, then got out of my car and walked around to the alley behind the building. The Foundation's rear exit was protected by a security keypad, but the adjacent coffee shop had a dumpster positioned conveniently close to a first-floor window. I'd climbed worse things under worse circumstances. The window was unlocked, small-town security at its finest. I slipped inside what appeared to be a storage room full of boxes labeled with exhibition names and donor information. Through the thin wall, I could hear voices from the next room. "Told you this was too risky," Claire was saying, her voice tight with stress. "If Alain finds out—" "Relax, darling." Henri's voice was smooth, practiced. Your husband's gardener is the least of our concerns right now. He's not just a gardener, Henri. You don't understand what he's capable of. What I understand is that we've been planning this for months. The Foundation's board meeting is Monday. If we're not in Zurich by then, everything falls apart. The Swiss accounts, the new identities, all of it. I pressed closer to the wall, my blood running cold. This wasn't just an affair. It was embezzlement. Claire and her lover were planning to disappear with the Foundation's money, leaving her husband and stepson behind to deal with the consequences. But Lucas, Claire started. We'll be fine, Henri interrupted. Dimitri assured me they won't hurt the boy as long as the judge cooperates. And even if things go sideways, we'll be long gone by then. Dimitri. That was a name I could work with. I can't believe we're doing this, Claire whispered. Bertrand has been good to me, and Lucas is just a child. Bertrand is a sanctimonious old fool who never appreciated what he had, Henri snapped. And you're finally free to live the life you deserve. We've been over this, Claire. There's no backing out now. I heard the sound of a chair scraping, footsteps moving around the room. The flight leaves at 6 a.m., Henri continued. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, we'll be sipping champagne in first class. What about the Russians? What if they don't release Lucas? Not our problem anymore. We gave Dimitri the information he needed, the judge's schedule, the boy's routine, the security system codes. What he does with it is between him and the Kozlovs. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Claire hadn't just been having an affair, she'd been feeding information to the kidnappers. Her stepson's abduction was the perfect cover for her disappearance with Henri and the Foundation's money. While the judge was focused on getting Lucas back, they'd be halfway around the world with their stolen millions. I'd heard enough. Moving carefully through the storage room, I began photographing documents with my phone, donor lists, financial records, anything that might be useful later. In a file marked International Transfers, I found bank routing numbers for accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. Amounts that made my eyes widen, $3.2 million transferred in small increments over the past 6 months. My phone vibrated with an incoming text. I glanced at the screen and nearly dropped it. The message was from Claire's phone, but the photo attached showed Lucas tied to a chair in what looked like a warehouse. His face was bruised, his school uniform torn. Below the image, a message. Proof of life. 18 hours remaining. But I'd just seen Claire in the next room, nowhere near her phone. I heard Henri's voice through the wall. Perfect timing. Send the photo to her husband, then turn the phone off. We can't have them tracking the GPS. The bastard was using Claire's phone to communicate with the kidnappers, making it look like she was still cooperating with their demands while actually preparing to abandon everyone, including her stepson, to save her own skin. I had to get out of there and find Lucas before it was too late. I was halfway back to the storage room window when I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Someone was coming. I flattened myself against the wall, holding my breath as the door handle turned. Henri Laurent stepped into the room, flicking on the lights. He was carrying a box of files, probably more evidence to destroy before their escape. He set the box down near the window, my window, and began sorting through papers. I was trapped. For several minutes, I watched him work, looking for an opportunity to slip past. But Henri was thorough, checking every document before feeding it into a portable shredder he'd brought with him. The man was covering his tracks like a professional. That's when I noticed something that made my blood boil. One of the files he was destroying had Lucas's name on it. School records, probably obtained through Claire's access to the district database. They'd been planning this kidnapping for weeks, maybe months, using an innocent teenager as a pawn in their escape plan. I'd seen enough evil in my time with the Legion, warlords who used child soldiers, dictators who murdered their own people, mercenaries who'd sell their mothers for the right price. But there was something particularly nauseating about this kind of betrayal, this calculated destruction of a family for money. Henri finished with the files and headed back toward the door. As soon as it closed behind him, I was moving. Out the window, across the alley, back to my car. I had maybe an hour before they realized someone had been in their storage room, maybe less if Henri was as paranoid as he seemed. But now I knew where to look for Lucas. The photo they'd sent showed concrete walls, industrial lighting, and what looked like shipping containers in the background. There were only 3 places in the Mills Lake area that matched that description. The old textile factory on the south side of town, the abandoned rail yard near the highway, and the storage facility behind Kozlov's restaurant. I was betting on the restaurant. Kozlov's Golden Eagle sat on a lonely stretch of Route 7, a gaudy testament to new money and questionable taste. The restaurant itself was closed at this hour, but the storage facility behind it was lit up like a prison yard. I parked a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, using the tree line for cover. 2 men stood guard outside the main building, both large, both armed, both looking bored enough to be dangerous. Eastern European features, expensive tracksuits, the kind of casual menace that screamed organized crime. I circled the perimeter, looking for another way in. The facility was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, but there was a drainage culvert that ran under the northeast corner. It would be tight, dirty, and probably full of rats, but I'd crawled through worse things for worse reasons. The culvert was everything I'd expected and more. By the time I emerged inside the fence, I was covered in mud and whatever else had been washed down from the parking lot over the years. But I was inside, and I had a clear view of the building where they were holding Lucas. 3 more guards inside, based on the shadows moving past the windows. At least 5 men total, probably more. Not impossible odds, but not great ones either. I needed an advantage. That's when I remembered the business card in my pocket, Henri Laurent's business card, found at the kidnapping site. The same Henri Laurent who was planning to flee the country in 6 hours, leaving these Russians to deal with the consequences of their actions. I had an idea. A risky, probably stupid idea, but an idea nonetheless. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number on the card. Henri answered on the second ring. Laurent Foundation. Henri, I said, disguising my voice with a thick Russian accent. We have problem. Dmitri? What kind of problem? Boy is sick, very sick, maybe dying. Need doctor or whole plan falls apart. There was a long pause. That wasn't part of the deal. You were supposed to keep him healthy until... Plans change, I interrupted. You want boy alive for exchange? You come now. Bring medical supplies. I can't just leave. You come now, or boy dies and judge never cooperates. Your choice. I hung up before he could respond, then settled in to wait. Either Henri would come running to protect his investment, giving me a chance to even the odds, or he'd ignore the call and stick to his escape plan. Either way, I'd learned something useful about his priorities. 20 minutes later, a silver Mercedes pulled into the storage facility parking lot. Henri Laurent got out, carrying what looked like a first aid kit and wearing the expression of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. One of the guards met him at the entrance, and they talked for several minutes before going inside together. Perfect. Now I had confirmation that Lucas was in that building, and I'd reduced the guard count by drawing Henri into the open. Time to move. I approached the building from the blind side, where a loading dock provided cover and access to a service door. The lock was industrial grade, but I'd learned a few tricks during my years in places where breaking and entering was considered a survival skill. 3 minutes later, I was inside. The building was a maze of shipping containers and industrial equipment, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that created deep shadows between the stacked cargo. I could hear voices from the center of the facility, Henri arguing with someone in accented English, demanding to see the boy immediately. I moved carefully between the containers, following the sound of their voices. Through a gap between 2 stacks, I could see them, Henri, 3 guards, and a 4th man who was probably Dimitri, older, scarred, wearing a suit that had seen better decades. "Where is he?" Henri was demanding. "You said he was sick." "Relax," Dimitri replied in his thick accent. "Boy is fine. Maybe little bruised, but fine. You worry too much." "I need to see him. If he dies before the exchange, he not die. We professionals." That's when I spotted Lucas. He was tied to a chair in a makeshift cell created by positioning 4 shipping containers in a square. Even from a distance, I could see the bruises on his face, the way he was slumped forward in exhaustion or pain. The sight of that 17-year-old boy, a good kid who'd never hurt anyone, whose only crime was being born into a family that had attracted the wrong kind of attention, filled me with a cold, familiar rage. The same rage I'd felt in Chad when I'd found a village full of murdered civilians. The same rage that had gotten me in trouble with the French authorities in the first place. Some things were worth going to prison for. I counted the guards again. 4 total, plus Henri. All of them focused on their argument about medical care and exchange procedures. None of them paying attention to the shadows between the shipping containers. I moved closer until I was positioned behind the container that formed the back wall of Lucas's makeshift cell. Through a gap in the metal wall, I could see the boy more clearly. He was conscious, alert, and apparently uninjured beyond some facial bruising. Good. That would make the extraction easier. "Lucas," I whispered through the gap. His head snapped up, eyes wide with surprise and hope. "Stay calm," I continued in the same low whisper. "I'm here to get you out. When I give the signal, drop to the floor and stay down. Understand?" He nodded slightly, trying not to look in my direction. "Good boy. 30 seconds. I moved around to the front of the container cell, where a single guard was stationed with his back to me. He was young, maybe mid-20s, more interested in the argument between Henri and Dimitri than in watching his prisoner. In the Legion, they teach you 17 different ways to incapacitate an enemy without making noise. I used number 3, a sleeper hold that cuts off blood flow to the brain. The guard went limp in my arms after about 10 seconds. I lowered him to the floor gently, took his keys and his gun, then unlocked the container door. "Time to go," I whispered to Lucas. He stood up shakily, his legs stiff from hours of being tied to the chair. I cut his restraints with the guard's knife, then handed him the man's jacket. "Put this on and keep your head down," I instructed. "We're walking out the back door like we belong here. If anyone stops us, let me do the talking." We made it halfway to the service door before someone noticed the unconscious guard. "Hey!" Dimitri's voice echoed through the facility. "Where is Sergei?" I grabbed Lucas's arm and started running. Behind us, I could hear shouting in Russian and English, footsteps pounding on concrete, the distinctive sound of weapons being readied. We reached the service door just as the first shot rang out, the bullet sparking off the metal frame inches from my head. "Keep running," I told Lucas as we burst out into the night air. "Don't look back. Don't stop. Just run for the trees." More shots followed us across the parking lot, but we were moving targets in poor light. Not an easy shot for anyone who wasn't a trained marksman. We reached the tree line and kept going, crashing through underbrush and low branches until we reached the drainage culvert. "Can you fit through there?" I asked Lucas, pointing to the narrow opening. "I think so. Go. I'll be right behind you." As Lucas squeezed into the culvert, I heard car engines starting up behind us. They'd be coming around the fence line in vehicles, trying to cut us off before we could reach my car. We had maybe a 2-minute head start. Lucas emerged from the culvert covered in mud, but uninjured. I followed, then grabbed his arm again. "This way. Stay low." We reached the Honda just as headlights appeared on the road behind us. I started the engine and pulled out without turning on my lights, using the moonlight to navigate until we were safely away from the storage facility. "Are you hurt?" I asked Lucas as we drove toward town. "Just bruises," he replied, his voice shaky but determined. They kept asking me about Dad's cases, his schedule, stuff like that. I didn't tell them anything. "Good man. Your father's going to be very proud." Is he okay? They said they'd kill him if he didn't change some verdict. Your father's fine, and he's not changing any verdicts. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Lucas, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Did you see Claire, your stepmother, at any point during your kidnapping? He was quiet for a moment, thinking. No, but one of the guards mentioned her name, something about how she'd provided them with information about our family's routines. I nodded grimly. What else did you hear? They talked about money a lot, and someone named Henri who was supposed to pay them extra if they kept me alive until tomorrow morning. Henri Laurent? Yeah, that sounds right. Do you know him? We've met, I said, pulling out my phone to call Judge Morel. Your father's going to want to hear from you personally. As Lucas talked to his father, assuring him that he was safe and uninjured, I began planning the next phase of my evening. Henri and Claire thought they were going to catch a 6 a.m. flight to Switzerland, leaving behind a trail of destruction and betrayal. The Russians thought they were going to collect ransom money for a kidnapping that had gone sideways. They were all wrong. But first, I had a 17-year-old boy to get home safely. Everything else could wait until he was back in his father's arms. Judge Morel was waiting in his driveway when we pulled up at 2:47 a.m., still wearing the same clothes from earlier that evening, but looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past few hours. The relief on his face when Lucas got out of the Honda was almost painful to watch, the kind of raw emotion that reminded you why some things were worth fighting for. Dad, I'm okay, Lucas said, as his father crushed him in a bear hug. Alain got me out. He saved my life. The judge looked at me over his son's shoulder, and I saw something in his eyes that went beyond gratitude. He knew there was more to this story, and he knew that whatever came next wasn't going to be pleasant for anyone involved. Let's get inside, I said quietly. We have about 3 hours before things get complicated. In the judge's study, I laid out everything I'd discovered. Claire's affair with Henri Laurent, their plan to embezzle money from the foundation and flee to Switzerland, her role in providing information to the kidnappers. I showed him the photographs I'd taken of the financial records, played the audio I'd recorded of their conversation, explained how they'd used Lucas's kidnapping as cover for their escape. Judge Morel listened in silence, his face growing paler with each revelation. When I finished, he sat back in his leather chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. She's really gone, isn't she? He said finally. Not just physically, but the woman I married, the woman I thought I knew. She's been gone for a long time. I'm sorry, sir. Don't be. Better to know the truth than to live with a lie. He looked at Lucas, who had fallen asleep on the study couch despite everything that had happened. What about the Russians? Are they still a threat? Not to Lucas. They know their plan failed, and they know I can identify them. They'll be halfway back to Brighton Beach by morning, trying to figure out how to explain this mess to their bosses. And Henri? Claire? I checked my watch. 3:15 a.m. Their flight leaves in less than 3 hours. They're probably at the airport already, thinking they've gotten away with it. Judge Morel stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the lake that had given this community its name. In the moonlight, the water looked like black glass, perfectly still and deceptively peaceful. I could have them arrested, he said. Embezzlement, conspiracy, accessory to kidnapping. Claire would spend the next 20 years in federal prison. You could, I agreed. But that would mean a very public trial, a lot of media attention, questions about how much you knew and when you knew it. Your reputation, your career, Lucas's future, all of it would be dragged through the mud. What are you suggesting? I joined him at the window, choosing my words carefully. I'm suggesting that there are different kinds of justice, sir. Legal justice, which is clean and official and leaves everyone feeling righteous, and practical justice, which is messier, but sometimes more educational. The judge turned to look at me. What did you have in mind? Give me 12 hours. By tonight, Henri Laurent and Claire will wish you'd had them arrested instead." He studied my face for a long moment, probably weighing his oath as an officer of the court against his rage as a betrayed husband and father. "I don't want to know the details," he said finally, "but I want them to understand what they've done. I want them to face consequences for their choices." "They will, sir. I promise you that." At 4:30 a.m., I was parked outside Henri Laurent's house, a modernist glass and steel monstrosity that screamed new money and questionable taste. His Mercedes was in the driveway, which meant he'd come home to pack before heading to the airport. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see lights moving around inside. I waited until 5:15 a.m., then made my move. The front door was protected by an electronic lock, but the side gate to the backyard was secured with nothing more than a simple latch. Henri's home security was clearly designed to impress visitors rather than actually stop intruders. I made my way around to the rear of the house, where a sliding glass door provided access to what looked like a home office. The door was unlocked. Either Henri was incredibly careless, or he was in such a hurry to flee the country that he'd forgotten basic security measures. I slipped inside and began looking around. The office was a monument to Henri's ego, awards from various cultural organizations, photographs of him with local politicians and celebrities, expensive art that was probably stolen from his own foundation's collection. On his desk, I found a printed itinerary for Swiss Air Flight 347, departing at 6:45 a.m. for Zurich. 2 first-class tickets, booked under the names Henri Laurent and Claire Morel. Not for much longer. I heard footsteps upstairs, the sound of suitcases being dragged across hardwood floors. Henri was packing, probably trying to figure out what he could carry without looking suspicious. I moved quietly through the house, familiarizing myself with the layout, looking for opportunities. That's when I found Henri's real office, a hidden room behind a bookshelf, accessible through a concealed door that probably cost more than most people's cars. Inside, I discovered the true scope of his operation. Multiple bank accounts in different countries, false identity documents, detailed records of every dollar he'd stolen from the foundation over the past 3 years. $4.7 million in total, not just from the Laurent Cultural Foundation, but from 2 other nonprofits he'd managed before coming to Mills Lake. Henri Laurent was a professional thief, a con man who specialized in cultural organizations and wealthy communities where people were too polite to ask hard questions about their donations. I photographed everything, then began making copies of the most incriminating documents. If Henri thought he was going to disappear into Swiss banking anonymity, he was about to learn otherwise. At 5:45 a.m., I heard a car pull into the driveway. Through the office window, I watched Claire get out of her Honda, looking nervous and excited at the same time. She was wearing traveling clothes and carrying a small suitcase, the bare minimum for someone planning to start a new life in a foreign country. "Henri," she called as she entered through the front door. "We need to leave in 10 minutes if we're going to make the flight." "Almost ready," Henri's voice came from upstairs. "Just grabbing the last few things." I had maybe 5 minutes before they left for the airport. Time to put my plan into action. I slipped out of the hidden office and made my way to Henri's garage, where I found exactly what I was looking for: his pride and joy, a restored 1967 Jaguar E-Type that he'd spent the last 2 years and probably $200,000 rebuilding. The man loved that car more than he'd ever loved any human being. Using a knife from Henri's own kitchen, I slashed all 4 tires, then used a screwdriver to scratch a simple message into the paint on both sides: "Thief." But that was just the beginning. I went back into the house and began systematically destroying everything Henri valued most. The awards went into the garbage disposal. The expensive art got redecorated with permanent marker. The photographs of him with important people received mustaches, devil horns, and other creative additions. In his bedroom, I found his collection of expensive watches: Rolex, Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, probably worth more than most people's houses. I gathered them all up and dropped them in the toilet, then flushed repeatedly until the water backed up and began flooding the bathroom floor. "Henri, what's that noise?" Claire called from downstairs. "Nothing, darling. Just finishing up." I moved to his walk-in closet, where rows of designer suits hung in perfect order. Using scissors from his desk, I began cutting, not destroying the clothes completely, just making small, strategic cuts that would render each garment unwearable. A snip here, a slice there, turning thousands of dollars worth of clothing into expensive rags. By the time I finished with the closet, it was 6:05 a.m. I could hear Henri and Claire talking urgently downstairs, probably realizing they were cutting it close for their flight. Time for the final touch. I went back to the hidden office and gathered up all the incriminating financial documents, then carried them downstairs to where Henri and Claire were waiting by the front door with their suitcases. "Going somewhere?" I asked, stepping into the foyer. Claire screamed and dropped her suitcase. Henri went pale and reached for something in his jacket. Probably a gun, though he didn't look like he'd ever used one. "I wouldn't," I said calmly. "You're already in enough trouble without adding assault charges." "How did you get in here?" Henri demanded, his voice shaking. "Same way I got into your storage room last night, and your foundation office, and the warehouse where you were holding Lucas." I held up the financial documents. Amazing what you can learn when you know where to look. Claire was staring at me with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Alain, I don't understand." "Sure you do, Claire. You understand perfectly. You've been feeding information to kidnappers, stealing money from charitable organizations, and planning to abandon your family to cover up your crimes." I smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "The only thing you don't understand is how badly you've miscalculated." Henri was trying to edge toward the door, but I stepped sideways to block his path. "Your flight leaves in 30 minutes, I continued conversationally. "Unfortunately, you're not going to be on it. See, while you were upstairs packing, I was downstairs making some phone calls. The FBI should be here any minute to discuss your creative accounting methods. The IRS is very interested in those Cayman Islands transfers, and Swiss banking authorities have been notified that you're traveling with stolen funds." "You can't prove anything," Henri said, but his voice lacked conviction. I held up my phone, showing him photographs of his hidden office and financial records. "Actually, I can prove everything. Bank transfers, false identities, correspondence with money launderers. It's all here, Henri. 3 years of evidence documented in your own handwriting." Claire sank into a chair, the reality of their situation finally hitting her. Oh God, what have we done?" "You've destroyed your lives for money," I said simply. "Money that you never even got to spend." That's when Henri made his mistake. Instead of accepting defeat gracefully, he decided to go down fighting. He pulled a small pistol from his jacket and pointed it at me with shaking hands. "Get out of my way," he said. "We're leaving, and you're not going to stop us." I looked at the gun, then at Henri's terrified face, then back at the gun. After 20 years of being shot at by professionals, it was almost insulting to be threatened by an amateur embezzler with a .22 caliber pea shooter. "Henri," I said patiently, "that's not how this works." I moved faster than he could track, stepping inside his reach and twisting his wrist until he dropped the weapon. Then I grabbed him by the shirt and walked him backwards until he was pressed against the wall, his feet barely touching the floor. "Let me explain something to you," I said quietly. "I've spent the last 20 years dealing with people who would eat you for breakfast and use your bones as toothpicks. Warlords, terrorists, mercenaries, the actual culprits, not pretend tough guys who steal from charities. You want to threaten me? You want to point guns at me in your own house? Fine. But understand that you're playing a game where I make the rules." I let him drop to the floor, then picked up his pistol and ejected the magazine. "Empty," I observed. "You were threatening me with an unloaded gun. That's either very stupid or very brave, and I don't think you're brave." Henri slumped against the wall, all the fight gone out of him. Claire was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks in black streaks. "What do you want?" she whispered. "Justice," I said, "but not the kind you get in courtrooms." I walked to Henri's front window and looked out at his vandalized Jaguar, sitting in the driveway like a wounded animal. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across his perfectly manicured lawn. "Here's what's going to happen," I said without turning around. "Henri, you're going to call the Laurent Cultural Foundation's board of directors and confess everything. Every dollar you've stolen, every law you've broken, every lie you've told. You're going to provide them with complete financial records and cooperate fully with their investigation. And if I don't?" I turned back to face him. "Then I release these documents to every newspaper, television station, and social media platform in the state. Your face will be on the evening news as the man who stole millions from cultural organizations. Your name will be synonymous with betrayal and theft. And that's before the FBI gets involved." "What about Claire?" Henri asked. I looked at her, still crying in her chair, and felt something that might have been pity if I were a more forgiving man. "Claire gets to go home and explain to her husband and stepson why she thought money was more important than family. She gets to live with the knowledge that she betrayed people who trusted her, that she put a 17-year-old boy's life in danger for the sake of a bank account she'll never see." "That's it?" Claire asked, looking up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "You're not going to have me arrested?" "That's not my decision to make," I said. "That's between you and Judge Morel. But I suspect he'll be more interested in getting you out of his life than in sending you to prison." I gathered up the financial documents and Henri's pistol, then headed toward the door. "Where are you going?" Henri called after me. "To return some stolen property to its rightful owners," I said, "and to make sure everyone in Mills Lake knows exactly what kind of people you really are." I paused at the door and looked back at them, a failed con man and an unfaithful wife, sitting in the ruins of their grand plan, finally understanding that actions have consequences. "Oh, and Henri, you might want to call a taxi. Your car seems to have developed some mechanical problems." I left them there, in that glass and steel monument to greed and betrayal, and drove back toward Mills Lake as the sun rose over Connecticut. Behind me, I could hear sirens in the distance, probably the FBI, arriving to begin their investigation into the Laurent Cultural Foundation's missing millions. By the time I reached the Morel estate, Judge Morel and Lucas were having breakfast on the terrace, looking like a family that had survived a nightmare and was ready to start rebuilding. They looked up as I approached, and I could see the questions in their eyes. "It's over," I said simply. "Henri Laurent will be spending the next 20 years in federal prison if he's lucky. The money will be returned to the Foundation's legitimate programs. And Claire—" "What about Claire?" the judge asked. I handed him a manila envelope containing copies of all the evidence I'd gathered, financial records, photographs, audio recordings, everything he would need to file for divorce and ensure that his unfaithful wife got nothing in the settlement. "That's your decision, sir. But I'd recommend changing the locks." Judge Morel nodded slowly, then stood up and extended his hand. "Thank you, Alain, for everything." I shook his hand, then looked out at the lake that had given this community its name. The water was calm this morning, reflecting the sky like a mirror, peaceful, safe, the way it should be. "Just doing my job, sir," I said. "Just doing my job." As I walked back toward the gardening shed to begin my regular duties, I could hear Lucas telling his father about his plans for the day: school, soccer practice, homework. Normal teenage concerns, the kind of problems that could be solved with time and patience rather than violence and betrayal. The roses needed pruning again. There was always more work to be done in the garden, always something that needed tending or fixing or protecting. It was honest work, peaceful work, the kind of labor that let a man sleep soundly at night, knowing he'd made the world a little bit better. Behind me, I heard Judge Morel making phone calls, to his lawyer, to the FBI, to the bank. beginning the long process of cleaning up the mess that Claire and Henri had made of their lives and the lives of everyone around them. But that was his job now. Mine was simpler: tend the garden, watch over the family, and make sure that nothing like this ever happened again on my watch. The roses were bleeding again, their deep crimson petals falling like scattered evidence. But this time, I didn't mind. Sometimes things had to be cut back before they could grow properly. Sometimes destruction was just another word for renewal. I picked up my pruning shears and got back to work.